All right. Okay. Welcome back to the final stretch of session 1. I'll just wait a moment when people sit down. But our first speaker for the second part is Fred Shone from Arup. He's going to talk to us about mobility and human behavior. And please start when you're ready.
Okay. Can everyone hear me at the back just fine? Sure. Cool. Yeah, hi everyone. Arup is an engineering consultancy, and I'll get into Arup City Modeling Lab in a second. Yeah, I'm Fred. I'm Arup's technical lead. I'm kind of standing in for Jerry, who's the research lead. And like the theme for this talk will be me trying not to talk about kind of research and trying to talk about some practicalities. And that's what my team does. Yeah, so first I will introduce what Arup City Modeling Lab is, and then I'm going to go through like something specific we did for the pandemic, for London in particular, and there's going to be 2 parts to that. It's going to be like our bread and butter, which is transport choice modeling, and then what happens if you stick a transmission model on top of that, and then I'm just going to go through challenges, but yeah, with like a real kind of with like my hard hat on in a way, like some practicalities. And I guess like the underlying theme will be about like dealing with complexity and getting it into like decisions, or trying to get someone to use it. And then finally, I just wanted to show people something we built with Pam, and then make like a final conclusion. Arup City Modeling Lab has existed for 4 and a little bit years. From like a technical point of view, we just use agent-based modeling or simulations. Simulations is a more useful way to think of it, to help people make typically transport decisions, but like it's a bit broader than that. Yeah, and I guess so. Like, City Modeling Lab doesn't employ any epidemiologists. I'm not really even sure how to pronounce it, but like we're kind of like consultants, practitioners, and then some software engineers, 1 mathematician. But like relevant to this talk, if you ask the people now 4 years in, most of us will say that we're software engineers, and that's important, I think, to this work. Yeah. So these are like our flagship projects. We're talking about real big, real detailed simulations, national or city scale. Yeah, we're working with New Zealand, Ireland, and now actually not just Suffolk, but the whole of Transport East. And we're building simulations, scenarios, yeah, to help inform decision making, typically around transport. So like, hey, I want to build something. What's it going to be like? I want to, and I'll get into this, but like really detailed simulations and really big. Yeah, and I guess this is kind of like where I hope to say something useful, because that's our bread and butter, right? Is not virus transmission modeling, but like building really big, really complicated models that people find a bit suspicious and getting them to use them. We don't like work in a vacuum. Yeah, and if this is interesting, like come say hi. Like our time is very much 50% research and 50%, I guess, consulting nowadays. We prefer the research bit. Yeah, so this is kind of what we normally do. This is what we've built up over the last 4 years. It's sort of a system. You can kind of sort of forget about orchestration, but that is sort of a big deal. This is like getting everything working as quickly as possible in parallel, yeah, on big computers, and being able to scale. But like the modeling part of what we do is network synthesis, population synthesis, simulation using MatSim, and then a whole ton of post-processing. This is choice modeling. So population synthesis is for us long-term choice modeling. Am I going to get married? How many kids? How many cars? Where am I going to live? Where am I going to work? And then shorter-term choice modeling. How am I going to get to work? Maybe am I going to go shopping today? What bus am I going to use? That sort of stuff. And then pretty crucial to what we're talking about is simulation. So they're kind of banged together as we do it, like the choice model and the simulation operate together, but we are providing choice modeling. And then we're providing a very detailed explanation of what that looks like. You should, if this is interesting, check out, Maxim. It's open source, but Java. So the population synthesis component, the long-term choice model, is using this, what unhelpfully the industry calls an activity-based representation or model, an ABM of demand of the whole population. So for London, we previously, almost more than 2 years ago, we previously done a collaboration with Transport for London. We built a simulation of London and surrounding area, including people insisting on like traveling into London from the Isle of Wight, for example. And this is a 1 million agent population. And for every agent, and this includes, this is an agent representation of people. They have ages, they live in households, they have kind of unique attributes and therefore in simulation behaviors and restrictions. And they have these activity plans that describe what they want to do for us within a 24-hour period. And then the network synthesis side, this is just showing like the level of detail in central London. What you can't see here is it's also operating scheduled bus services, tube services, train stations. People are able to walk and cycle as well as drive. There's a sort of slightly hacked way of getting a taxi. And this network extends out, critically for our simulation, to the Isle of Wight and all around the UK, but although not in this level of detail. And then we throw into the simulation, we throw into Maxim. Don't really have time to explain Maxim, but Maxim is running the same simulation. It's extremely detailed representation of people trying to get to work and then go to the shops within 24 hours. And what it allows the agents to do is seek to optimize their choices. And so when we finished with Maxim, we have this representation of people moving around London and surrounding area, describing when they go in and out of facilities, buildings, or maybe parks, like when they get into their vehicles, or which could include public transit vehicles, and how they navigate the network. We typically refer to these as just containers because they contain people for some period of time, some mixture of people for some period of time, which obviously we thought would be useful for transmission modeling. So that was our bread and butter, and these are the questions we would normally answer in grey, and then Transport for London essentially ask us, like, what about transmission risk? And what we did is just hack our existing stuff, and we just whack on someone else's project, developed in Berlin, and still in development in Berlin 2 years later, so for sure it would be a lot better now. We whack Episim on top, and Episim just takes this sort of 24-hour simulation or output, it's a representation of where everyone was and where, and it cycles it through like a daily transmission model, and you can, this is their picture, like you could have a virus transmission model in exquisite detail with people, like transmitting on public transit as well as at home, as well as at various like building locations. And then another little bit, which I'll dip into at the end, is we've built a way to quickly build these lockdown scenarios. So yeah, choice modeling hat on. We have this kind of like pipeline: population synthesis, our long-term choice model; simulation, our short-term choice model; and then we whack Epsilon on top. It's really useful for us, and I'll repeat this probably a few times, to like break the model down into stages. Because essentially we're building each one and building scenarios for each one, and then trying to get assurance at each stage. And crucially, we're not like really letting them feed back into each other. This sort of makes things like calibration easier, but also just if you already have a lot of assurance, if you already have a client who likes your population synthesis model, then you're already like a third of the way there. So yeah, into challenges, and I kind of pose that. I normally speak to people who are like not entirely clear about what ABM like necessarily stands for, or they have some preconceptions and they're generally not very keen on them. So I kind of I'm going to pose these slightly as traditional agent-based modeling challenges. And the first one is unsurprisingly, like they're too slow. And the point really nowadays is that like that's kind of a bit 1970s thinking. Yeah, it's just not the case. If you have a lot of computers and they're pretty big, like you can go real fast. This is based entirely around the idea that you have the right tools. And that's something that my team has done like a lot of work towards over 4 years. And that's the tooling to let you get onto the big computers like easily and to get onto as many as you like very easily. And so there comes a point with simulation where you can't feel like you can't really go any faster. What you can do is just run more of your scenarios at the same time, effectively like limitlessly, or until servers in Greenland run out of space. And I've sort of, and it sort of relies a lot, this idea of like, sort of separating the model up into stages. So we don't try and calibrate the whole thing at the same time. Like we go through bit by bit, get assurance from whoever we're trying to convince, give them assurance. And then, move on to the next bit. And then like a really critical point that I'm sure everyone sort of won't find that surprising is that like, sometimes it's not really the model that needs to go faster, but just the way that you're operating it, the way you're building it or running it that needs to go faster. And like for sure, like 90% of our software development is just like making stuff easier to use, not necessarily faster. ABMs are too complex, which I kind of mean by that you're like, there's a lot of uncertainty or they're unstable. So you run it twice, you get a different answer. Great news, it's not really the case for MatSim. This is our astonishing finding over the last 4 years, which is like, we add this huge amount of complexity in simulations, like these real world restrictions. You know, you cycle to work, you can't now drive your car home again. You know, your access restricted, you can't use this train station. You would like to be home, you know, at the end of the day. Like, we put all of this detail and a lot more into simulation. And this is like scary for people. It's like, well, this is complexity you're adding in. But it turns out that actually, like, you end up with less unknowns. You have more stable outputs. It's very pleasant. However, it's not the case for Episim. Like there's like a lot of stochastics in that model, and you just have to run it like a lot of times before you can really say anything about your results. The sort of hack going on maybe is like we tried, it's definitely a hack. We try to make uncertainty exogenous to that model, either by pushing it into like a previous stage, or just by like saying, no, we're not modeling this. And like my team, like we're not allowed to use the word forecast, we have to say scenario. And a lot of our tooling doesn't really model, it modifies. And I will cover an example of that called PAM at the end. And that's the idea, is we're building scenarios. We're not trying to necessarily forecast the future. And this is a slight repetition about MatSim. So what we found is that we're just adding in this complexity. Bus services that operate, you know, to the second. People live like a certain amount of distance and they have to navigate a network to get to maybe the bus stop they want to use, so on and so on. This like enormous complexity for sure has like loads of difficulties around like just handling data, finding compute, but it turns out it makes some stuff like a lot easier. And one of the things that makes kind of easy is assurance, because you look at the model and it looks like reality. And I guess an pleasant way of describing that would just be like people just like, you can skip some parts of assurance. You don't have an abstraction that you need to convince people is correct. They will look at it and they'll be like, yeah, okay. And then flexibility. So, which I will explain in a second. So that point about assurance is like, people generally say like, how do you validate an ABM? And like for sure, our experience, so by dipping into the complexity, so making the simulation more realistic, Just turns out we have like a lot more ways of like a lot more sources of data, a lot more ways of validating. And then like people can look at it and it looks right. We find these models with less abstraction easier to get assurance and easier to convince people. And that's, like saying, hey, look, all these moving dots, it is like they're persuasive, which is for sure dangerous. Sort of a level of precision way above necessarily like the accuracy, but it is useful. And then the way like something we do is like focus a lot on good code. We're all kind of more aware of this recently, but like, our team behaves like computer engineers. We engage really like a lot in the quality of code, in distributed version control and collaborative working. And most of our like tooling and code base now is open source. And so other people can also use it, and other people have also checked it, and other people have also contributed to it beyond my team. And then we've kind of talked about like we don't really build scripts. So what I showed you earlier, this model process, we don't press a button or fill in a config file and get it to run from A to Z. Like we run stuff in stages and we build stuff to work in stages. And we find that we can then use it twice. And that's kind of the point about flexibility. We remove the abstractions and like what I'm showing you is a great example of it, right? We have a transport model and we're using it as a virus transmission model. We also use it as to model emissions. We use it to model like equity around economics. Someone comes along and says, hey, bad news, or I've got like e-scooters now around this train station. Like you don't throw away your old model, you just bang it into the simulation. So you kind of can like pick up work you've already done and use it again a lot, which is quick and also for, I guess, the client, good value for money. And then the big challenge that I think is true is like it's hard to calibrate an ABM, whichever ABM I'm talking about. It is. From our point of view, the most awkward thing is that like research that is sort of showing here's an agent-based model that you can automatically calibrate doesn't really like have what we like, which is the really detailed simulation, and that seems like a trade-off at the moment. Talk about our approach, this idea of compartmentalizing models, so having something, and literally now, so like for us, the Maxim simulation of London was already in place, already somewhat assured and all ready to go. Nowadays, we also hold like a synthetic population of Great Britain ready to go. So like, we've compartmentalized this stuff and we've already done it, I guess, and we know it's going to be useful in the future. And then this hack about restricting unknowns. And that is like leaning into the simulation. So trying to get rid of abstractions. And that is not really engaging in stuff with high uncertainty, not engaging in forecasting, just building scenarios. And then going fast, but then going fast is sometimes running it fast and sometimes building it fast. And the point, so there's three components. They've all taken a different approach. The population synthesis stuff, basically we're like, this is too hard. Like these long-term choices, we're not really very good at it. And so we build scenarios. The simulation stuff, we add complexity and actually it gets easier. So we add the complexity and we learn how to build them faster. And Episim, we're just like, we just need to run this a lot. So we make it fast and we run it thousands of times. I'm running out of time. I would love people to look at PAM. It's a tool that came out of, it's an open source tool that came out of the pandemic. It does activity-based modifications. So you can ingest or create a synthetic population, modify it, and then write it out again. It's open source. Even the Office for National Statistics is perhaps using it. And this is how we used it for London. It's just like, it has a lot of complexity under the hood. It takes like this household representation of populations, of households, people, and these are activity sequences. And it lets you make these kind of simple business like rule modifications. And then for us, we would validate it against Google mobility data. For us, we don't really want to do virus transmission modeling. We want to answer these sorts of questions, which we still think are useful. And this seems like, in practice, like these seem like common questions that we should be answering. So like usually a policymaker doesn't really have that much scope for some maybe like wild scenarios. And so really we're just testing one scenario or a few scenarios or within some small bounds. And this stuff, yeah, we think is useful. And it's also stuff that we do day to day. We have a lot of confidence about the outputs and we have the tooling to do it already. Sorry, a bit slow.
Thanks very much, Fred. Anyone have any questions? Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. As an agent-based modeler myself, I very much appreciated the clear way you've set out the defense of agent-based modeling. Just a couple of suggestions. I don't think you mentioned that from agent-based modeling, because they're an individual-based model and the individuals can record their personal histories, you can do things that a mathematical model either can't do or would struggle to do, such as explaining distributions, such as why do 80% of cases come from 10% of infectious people? So that's one thing that you could stress. Another thing is when we're talking about validation, we can encourage people to think that it's not just you're validating the model, you're validating the whole modeling process, including all those assumptions you made at the start, or the very decision of using an agent-based model rather than a mathematical model. I mean, to go back to what I said before, universal mixing, that's a very strong assumption to have built into your model. Is it reasonable? On the plus side, if you do it, the maths is easy, you get very quick answers. On the minus side, maybe it's an unreasonable assumption to make, and we're introducing some biases here. So these are the kind of things, this whole process needs validating, and the agent-based model is making that much more explicit. I like to think, whereas with the mathematical modelers, sometimes these issues they get forgotten about.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, I would normally describe this approach to most audiences as a simulation-based methodology, because it is not really the ABM that is useful, I guess, for a lot of our application. It's the simulation for good reasons, like dealing with trying to make unknowns actually knowns, like embracing physical models and like good assumptions. Okay. But also as tools to convince people of stuff.
And one quick question, the same question that I put to Mark Birkin earlier. Have you tried comparing the behavior of your modeling approach with other approaches, such as a mathematical model?
So within our primary domain of transport and within the realms of maths, yes. Within EPSIM, no. And in fact, I mean, that would be the crux of my talk. It's like, if you are not an epidemiological modeler, probably don't do it. Yeah.
I'll come to you next.
Thank you. As an agent-based modeler, I also appreciate, and I thank for all the comments that you had there. One thing I wanted to ask is about uncertainty. So when you're doing all these changes, scenarios, etc., that you're talking about, you're really magnifying all sorts of uncertainty, not just in the parameters, but in the robustness of the outcome via the uncertainty of the stochasticity that you have to maybe add more simulations, etc. So my question is, how do you control for that? Yeah. And then the second one is, so do you think an approach where we sort of combine some kind of machine learning or some kind of repetitive analysis that looks like machine learning before you sample your ABC or you reject ABC would be the way to validate them?
Yeah, I mean, from the machine learning point of view, so our direction of travel is to have more complicated simulations that run slower, and ML doesn't fit so well within that sort of direction. The first question, so for populations in this long-term choice modeling, we do modeling. There's lots of existing stuff out there, and we kind of do some of our own stuff, but we're like the uncertainty is like, there's a lot of unknown parameters. I don't know how the model really should work. How am I know? Like, I have all this precision, but I have to try and decide where this person is going to move house to in 20 years time. Like, yeah, we just sort of decide that that's unmodelable. That's not like literally correct, but this is where we've been into just modifying scenarios with tools like PAM. And this is kind of okay for us because then we hand over this like long-term choices into the simulation model. And then the simulation is into like shorter term choices. And then we just have this different approach where we've been using Matson for 4 years. And so we know like, yeah, there are loads of ways that it can like, it's ABM, can like kind of fool you. It has all this precision, but actually you run it twice or 10 times and it keeps giving you different answers. But yeah, we have a lot of assurance. And so I think like the theme for today maybe is like how we're going to respond in the future. The point is like, yeah, we have a simulation of various places and they have this like, we have a lot of assurance and can give a lot of assurance about the stability of those outputs. We know the appropriate levels of aggregation to deal with. And that lets us answer some of those questions here. So like we know how long people are spending together and who else they spend time with. But then like the transmission model on top, maybe like there'll be improvements, but yeah, like we just have to run it like, yeah. We have high uncertainty, you have to run it thousands and thousands of times. We're not even really sure for us, like if we're even answering the right questions. So we would probably just say, don't go that far, like try and use what we've already got essentially. I guess that's quite a boring conclusion.
Sorry, just got time for one more question from Julia, but hopefully you can ask later.
Fred, thank you very much for your talk.
Sorry.
I know you don't want to be quizzed on epi modeling by an epi modeler,
Yeah.
but something you said, which is that less abstraction makes it easier to convince people. Probably
Yeah.
had all the epi modelers twitching a bit.
Yeah.
And the reason for us is we know if you add more detail, but it's slightly wrong, you can make the models be a worse reflection of reality for what you want to do. Or even if you add more detail and it's right, but you've missed another component, you can make things further from reality than simple models. So what I'd like to understand, if you go back to your list of questions, for that class of questions, which are mostly about movement, for those, how do you choose the right level of detail? Or for this class of questions, is it always you add more detail and it's better?
So, I mean, for such a long answer, the sort of slightly more traditional domain we come from is like, it loves abstraction. You like to think about transport as flows of cars from A to B. And then just like the kind of the trend for that domain over like 30 years is like to try and add like more detail, which is segmentation. And there's like this horrendous diminishing return to like effort. And so now we come along and say like, no, like, and it's sort of a surprise in a way. It's like, hey, here you go, add in like tons and tons of complexity. And like suddenly some stuff gets easier. Some technical stuff, some stuff gets easier. And some of that's like the bad reasons, right? Is that people look at it and you can convince them that this is real because they see a bunch of dots moving around. And that is obviously dangerous, but sometimes useful. And then maybe the point about like, for transport, this makes you kind of take some like abstract concept about like some marginal utility. I'm an economist, probably doesn't want me to think of it as abstract, and then you turn it into something like, no, I can't now get the bus because it doesn't go to exactly where I need to go, or now I can't like cycle home because I left my bike at home. Like that works within transport, this kind of adding in of detail and rules. I'm not going to claim that will also work for a virus transmission model. But I would be like, I mean, my experience is that I would be optimistic about it. So EPICM models like people sat on buses, essentially like this idea of a row of seats. I think actually it's moved on a long way. And so it says like there's some, probability based on where you are that you'll transmit to these people. But, maybe they could lean into a bit more detail about the row in front or the row behind or the type of bus or whether the windows are open or closed. And at some point, our experience with transport is like, or mobility of people is that you add enough detail. And some of those abstractions which were like unknown variables has to be estimated, actually just become like physically known parameters. But I don't want to say that for sure will work for virus transmission model. And essentially that's why we're like, no, we want to answer those questions because those are the ones that it's worked for.
Thank you very much, Fred. Our final speaker for the session is Matt Keeling, who's going to speak about modeling outbreaks, models, data, and policy.
Yeah, when have I got till? Because
we can